Masechet Zevaḥim Daf Kof Yod Zayin. The first baraita is going to address the three different levels of holiness that are in the Israelite encampment and then were transferred to Yerushalayim. The three levels are while they were traveling in the desert in that formation, they had in the middle where the Aron was, and when they would settle, that's where they built the Mishkan. That was the innermost, most holy of the area of the Kohanim. Around that was the Machane of the Leviim, and surrounding that was the Machane of Yisrael. And there were different laws in each regarding someone who's tameh, to which one can he go into, or which ones does he have to stay out of. In the Bet HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, when it was built, you have an equivalence there that the temple courtyard, that would be equivalent to the Machane of the Kohanim. And the Temple Mount is equivalent to the Machane Leviyah. And the city of Yerushalayim, everything inside its walls, was the Machane Yisrael. So now Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai is teaching us that in the Bet HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, Od Acheret Haita, there was yet another area with another level of Kedusha, and that is the area of the women's courtyard. If we look at this picture here, so the temple courtyard itself is this area that includes the Hechal and the Mizbeach. So that would be the equivalent to the area of the Kohanim out in the desert. And the entire Temple Mount, which is not pictured here, but the whole area that would be around it, would be Leviyah. But then you have this in between, which is called the area, the Ezrat Nashim. It's not quite like an Ezrat Nashim in a Bet Knesset nowadays, where only women go there. It actually means that women and those of similar status could go up to that point, and then they of certain status cannot go past that point. Other people can go past that point somewhat, and depending on whether they're Kohanim, Leviim, Yisrael, their level of Tumah, and if they need to do something for service inside. So that's why it's called Ezrat Nashim. And this is what he teaches us, that in the Bet HaMikdash you had this Ezrat Nashim, which you did not have in the desert. And there was no punishment for it. In other words, really the Ezrat Nashim, Medaoraita, on the Doraita level, has the same status as the Temple Mount. But the rabbis made an extra elevated stringency that someone who's at Tevul Yom may not go to Ezrat Nashim. But there's no punishment for that because it's not a Torah law. Ubeshilo lo hayu ela shene machanot bilbad. However, in Shiloh, when they built the Mishkan in Shiloh, there were only two areas. Okay, so we know that there were three areas in the desert, and then there were three, and then plus one, 4 areas in Yerushalayim. In the times in between when they're at Shiloh, only 2 areas. That's all he says. Now the Gemara wants to know, Heminaihu lahava, which one was missing? Amar Rabba, mistabera de machane leviyah havai. Rabba says, it must be that there was a machane of Leviim. Why? Because if the area of the Leviim was not there, then nimseu zavin utmei metim mishtalachin chus machane achat. Then you will end up having a situation where someone who's tameh as a zav and someone who's tameh met will have to leave and go out of an encampment to the same place. But the Torah doesn't think that the zav and tameh met should be excluded to the same degree in the same place, because it says they shall not defile their camps in plural, and we learn from that ten machane lazeh umachane lazeh, that each of these tameh people should have his own area that he has to leave. And so in fact the law is that a tameh met is more lenient than a zav. A tameh met cannot be in the temple courtyard. He cannot be in the area of Kehuna. However, a tameh met is permitted to be on the Temple Mount. And that's the reason why, even nowadays, although everybody is Tameh Lamet, we don't have the Para Aduma. Nevertheless, one is permitted to go on to the Temple Mount, according to most poskim, as long as you don't go on to the area where the Bet HaMikdash itself was, or the courtyard was, but only around the outskirts of the Temple Mount. So a Tameh Met just has to go outside of the Machaneh of Kohanim, but he can be in the area of Leviim. However, a Zav has to leave the Machaneh Leviyah. And cannot be. He has to be outside. He can be within Machaneh Israel, which means he can't go on the Temple Mount. He can be within the walls of Yerushalayim, but not in the Temple Mount. Now, if there was no area for Leviim, well, then the Tameh Met would have to go outside of the Kehuna area, and then would be in the same area as the Zav. But that's not okay. You have to have a separation between the Tumah of Met, who goes out of one encampment, and Zav, who goes out of two encampments. So therefore, there has to be that there is a Machaneh Leviyah. Okay, so what do you want to say? Maybe there's no Machaneh Israel, which would mean that Tameh Met, he can be in the Machaneh Leviyah. And then the Zav, well, there is no Machaneh Israel, so you have to leave everything altogether. We have to be totally outside. This would be in Shiloh. He would have to be just totally outside. But then you'd have a situation where a Zav and a Mesorah is even worse. Mesorah has to be outside of everywhere altogether. And if there was no Machaneh Israel, that means the Zav, who is excluded from Kehuna and Leviyah, would be outside totally, and Mesorah also would be in the same place, because there is no buffer between the Leviyah and totally outside, because there's no Machaneh Israel. And that can't be, because the Torah says regarding a Mesorah, Badad Yeshev, he has to dwell alone, totally isolated. And so there cannot be there can be another Mesorah with him. They can have company of Mesoraim, which we have stories about, but there cannot be a Zav with the Mesorah. And therefore there has to be a Machaneh Israel also. And there has to be certainly a Machaneh Kehuna, because that's where the Mishkan of Shiloh is. So now we can't do without any of them. Rather, in fact, all three encampments were there in Shiloh. And when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said that there's only two machanot, he didn't mean completely. He meant for one specific law of liklita, as a city of refuge, meaning that during the time of Shiloh, there was no city of refuge. Otherwise, beforehand, when they were in the desert, if there's someone killed by mistake, and so there's no established cities, they're not in the land yet, so they didn't have an official Ir Miklat. So what would someone do if they killed by mistake and didn't want the blood avenger to come and get them? They could go to Machaneh Leviyah, and they would stay safe. They just dwelled with the Leviim, and then they were safe there. That's true in the desert, but when they got to Shiloh, there was no space like that. Maybe so. That's what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai meant. Now we ask, okay, that assumes that in fact in the desert, the encampment of the Leviim would bring someone in and give them refuge if they killed by mistake. Is that true? And the answer is yes. And in fact we have a braita that says so. V'samti lecha makom b'chayecha, makom mekomcha, asher yanu shama melamed she maglin b'midbar, lechan golin lemachaneh leviyah. A braita teaches that Hashem told Moshe, you shall make a place of refuge. And so when it says you, lecha, that means you, Moshe, in your own lifetime. It doesn't have to wait until Bnei Israel go into the land and conquer it and then make cities. In the meantime, you have to make one now, even in the desert. Makom, where is it going to be? In your place, Moshe. Where does Moshe dwell? He is in Machaneh Leviyah. So it's going to be there. And someone who kills inadvertently will run there for refuge. So we see here that there was a place of refuge, even in the desert. Where would they go to? Machaneh Leviyah. So yes, we had that in the desert, and then we didn't have it in Shiloh. Mikan amru ben Levi sheharag goleh mipelech lepelech v'im gala lefilcho pilko kolto. Now that we learn this, that the area of Levi can, and eventually the city of the Levi, acts also as an Ir Miklat, in addition to any other Ir Miklat that's specifically designated for that. So now what if a Levi kills someone unintentionally? Well, then what should he do? He should also go into exile from one Levite city to a different Levite city. He should also experience the exile. That's part of the atonement, purification, is to go from one city to another. So he'll go to another Levite city and be safe there. However, Bidi Avad, if he didn't go to his city, then he moves from one area in his city to another. He should still leave his home, leave his area, that neighborhood, and go to a different neighborhood. But even within the same city, still that will be effective as refuge, and the Goel Adam cannot come and kill him. My kira, what's the source? Amarav Acha bered Rav Ika ki ba'ir miklato yeshev ir shekelatatu kevar. It's from this pasuk because that says, "For in his city of refuge he shall dwell." Which means that even if he's in a city that he already was admitted to, he was already there because he already lived there, so he was already admitted there, and so he can stay even in the same city. He moves from one place to another, and so even if that's where that happens to be where he already lived before, it still is effective as a city of refuge. The Mishnah continued and taught, Ba'u la Gilgal, when Bnei Israel came into the land and they were settled in Gilgal and they built a public bama at Gilgal. From that point on, for the next 14 years, private bamot were permitted. Now we're going to see a baraita with a number of different opinions about what was permitted to offer on private bamot as opposed to public bamot. Teno Rabanan, Kol nidar v'nidab haya kareb babama, she'en nidar v'nidab en kareb babama, mincha unzirut kerebin babama dibre Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is addressing only the private bama that one makes. You can make it on your rooftop in your own backyard, and so anything that is voluntarily offered, that you can offer as a vow, or voluntarily means you take it upon myself. I'm going to bring you could bring a korban shelamim or korban olah. Those are the two types of things that you can voluntarily bring, or you can say this animal will be an olah or a shelamim. If you can voluntarily vow to bring it, then you can bring it on a private bama. But something that you cannot voluntarily bring, like a korban asham and a korban hatat, you can't. It's only if you actually sin by mistake, so you actually can't do it on purpose. So those are not brought on private bamot. Now, when we say something that is a part of a vow, that does include a korban mincha, according to the Rabbi Meir, you can bring a korban mincha, and also the korbanot associated with being a nazir. We're going to see as machloket, all the korbanot associated with nazir, or only some of them. For sure, an olah and shelamim that a nazir has to bring, that he can bring also on a private bama. Why? We said voluntary offerings. Well, it is a voluntary offering. You vow voluntarily to be a nazir. Once you're a nazir, if you become tameh or when you finish the process, then you have to bring various korbanot. So since the whole nizirut is voluntary with a vow, therefore the associated some or maybe even all of the associated korbanot, including, we'll see if it includes asham and hatat that a nazir has to bring. Perhaps that's also included by Rabbi Meir, perhaps not. But anyway, for sure, the olot and shelamim are also included. Okay, what is not addressed here explicitly, but we can see from the continuation of the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to see, is going to argue on a different point. So we can tell from there that Rabbi Meir says regarding the public bama, that only communal offerings can be offered on the public bama, or an individual can bring on the public bama what he can also bring on the private bama. What's not included here is an individual who wants to bring a non-voluntary korban. So, according to the Rabbi Meir, at the time of Gilgal, there was no place that an individual could bring a mandatory korban, like a korban hatat. So that's what cannot be brought at all, and what's not said here is that even on the public one at Gilgal, there was a big public altar is communal. The public can only bring a communal offering, and an individual there can only bring a voluntary offering. Hachamim omrim lo karabu yachid ela alot ushlamim bilbad. Hachamim disagree with Rabbi Meir regarding the private bama. He agrees that an individual can bring a voluntary korban, meaning olot or shilamim, but he does not include korban mincha and does not include the korban of a nazir. We'll see here also machloket. Does he not include even an olah and shilamim of a nazir? Maybe maybe that also is not included, or maybe that's okay. But anyway, his point would be that although yes, you can decide to be a nazir voluntarily based on a vow, once you are a nazir, then those korbanot that he brings are obligatory. So he calls that obligatory. But Rabbi Meir and Chachamim are going to agree that on the public bama, one brings communal or voluntary or individual voluntary, but not individual obligatory korbanot. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kol she'asibur v'yachid makrivin b'ol moed shebamidbar, makrivin b'ol moed shebagilgal. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and here he's talking about the public bama, and says anything that the community or an individual could have brought in Ohel Moed when they were in the desert, which is any korban, that can also be brought on the big altar, the public altar, and in Gilgal. So this includes all communal and all individual offerings, whether voluntary or obligatory. So you see, he disagrees regarding the public bama. Ma ben ohel moed shebamidbar leben ohel moed shebagilgal. So what is the difference between the two? Since we said regarding the ohel moed and the midbar and the ohel moed and Gilgal, you can bring all sacrifices on both of them. The answer is ohel moed shebamidbar lo hayu bamot mutarot, ohel moed shebagilgal hayu bamot mutarot. The difference is only regarding the private bamot. When they were in the desert, had Ohel Moed, then they were not allowed to make any private bamot. Whereas when the Ohel Moed was at Gilgal, then they were permitted to make private bamot. And that private bamot that he can make on his rooftop, you can only bring olah and shlamim. So in that sense, he agrees with the sages beforehand who say only a voluntary offering. That's a biuda. Chachamim omrim. Now this chachamim goes back to this chachamim here, and they seem to say the same thing. And the Gemara will ask about that. Kol shehasibur makrivin be'ohel moed shebamidbar, makrivin be'ohel moed shebagilgal. Vekan lo karbu yachid ela ola ushlamim bilbad. Anything that the public, only the public, can bring in Ohel Moed in the desert, that you can bring in the main bama, the public one, Ohel Moed in the Gilgal. But you see here it says only public korbanot. And in both places, an individual can only bring an olah shlamim. The individual could bring that in a bama at home or on the big bama. Also, he could bring his own, but only his individual voluntary offerings. And like we said above, for Chachamim here also, but a Yachid cannot bring mandatory korbanot. The last opinion, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Av sibur lo hikribu ela pesachim v'chavot shekavua lahen zeman. Rabbi Shimon says, even the public offerings, not all public offerings, rather korban pesach, yes, that is a public offering that can be brought, and chavot, public offerings that are mandatory, that have a fixed time. So that would include all the korban tamid and korban musaf, because they have a fixed time. So that, yes. But a communal offering that doesn't have a fixed time, for example, pad helem davar shel sibur. When the Sanhedrin makes a mistake, the community has to bring this pad helem davar shel sibur. This is a chovah, but it's not brought at a fixed time. You don't have to bring it tomorrow or at a fixed date. That was not brought on the public bama at Gilgal. That's the end of the Baraita. My Tamad Rabbi Meir. What's the source of Rabbi Meir? Damar kera lo ta'asun kechol asher anachnu osim po hayom. Amar len Moshe Yisrael, ki yaditu la'aretz, yesharot takribu, hobot lo takribu. The pasuk says that Hashem tells Moshe, do not do everything that we do here today, right? Everybody's doing ish asher hayashar be'enav ya'aseh. Everybody's doing literally whatever he wants, whatever he sees right. Oh, this seems like a nice thing to do, and everybody's go all over the place. Don't do that anymore. Now, what changed from before and after? So Moshe is telling Israel, when you go into the land, yesharot takribu. Yesharot here, it's not exactly the peshat of like, it sounds more of a negative, whatever you want to do, but here it's taken as that which is fitting in your eyes, meaning a voluntary offering. I decided, it's fit in my eyes, I feel like bringing a voluntary offering. Fantastic, chazak u'baruch. That, when you come into the land, you can continue to do hayashar be'enav, you can continue to bring voluntary offerings. But an individual cannot bring mandatory offerings, not on a private bama, not on a public bama. And korban mincha and the korbanot of a nazir, that's called yesharot, because those are also voluntary. Volunteer to bring a korban mincha, and you can volunteer to be a nazir, and then you have to bring the some or all of the sacrifices associated with a nazir. That's the source for the Rabbi Meir. V'Rabbanan, what's the source of Rabbanan? How come they disagree on mincha and nazir? Number one, en mincha babama. They have a rule, there's never a korban mincha on the bama. We're going to derive that in a couple of dapim after this. Nizirut, chovot, ninhu. And nizirut, for a korban for a nazir, Chachamim say that this is considered compulsory. Now, it's true, you volunteered to be a Nazir, fine, but now you're a Nazir, you have to bring these korbanot, and therefore, Chachamim say, you don't bring them. Amar Shemuel, machloket bechatat ve'asham, aval be'olot ushtamim, dibra kol yesharot ninhu ve'karbi. Shemuel is going to now explain that the machloket between Rabbi Meir and the sages regarding the korbanot of a Nazir, that's only regarding the chatat and the asham. Rabbi Meir says that the Nazir can bring all of them. Olah, Shelamim, Hatat, and Asham. Different combinations of them are brought depending on what happened to him. A Nazir who finished his term successfully, he has to bring a Asham and a Hatat. An Olah and a Hatat and a Shelamim. So Olah, Hatat, and Shelamim. But if it became Tameh in the middle, and then he has to restart, then he brings an Asham, a bird as an Olah, and a bird as a Hatat. Okay, so one way or another, it includes Olot and Shelamim and Hatat and Asham, depending on what happens to him. Okay, so Shemuel says that according to the Rabbi Meir, a Nazir can bring everything, Hatat and Asham, Olah, Shelamim, because he volunteered to be a Nazir. However, Chachamim would agree regarding Olot and Shelamim, since an individual can bring in general an Olah and Shelamim, because he can volunteer to bring one. So too, even if he's a Nazir and he has to bring one, he can still bring it that's Shemuel's opinion. Because that's also called yesharot, since this is a type of korban that you could bring if you wanted to. Motib Rabbah challenges this statement of Shemuel, because it says in a baraita, Hazeh v'shoku trumat lachmei todah, nohagin babama gedola ve'en nohagin babama ketana. The baraita teaches that the breast and the thigh portions of the shelamim that are waved and given to the kohen, and also when you have a korban todah, you have 40 loaves altogether, and 4 of them, 4 loaves of the 40, one of each type, are also given to the kohen. That is given to the kohen in a bama gedolah. But if you're making a bama ketana at home, then you're making your own shelamim at home, then you don't have to give these parts to the kohen. That's all the baraita says. Now Rabbah notices that the baraita is missing something, because a nazir, when a nazir brings a shelamim, in addition to the hazeh and shok, he also has to bring the cooked foreleg, zeroa b'shela, and he has to give that also to the kohen. But that's missing here. So that means that there's this, according to this author of this baraita, thinks that a Nazir does not bring a Shelamim. Otherwise, he should have included this also and said, oh, yeah, you bring it on the public bama, but not on the private bama. So that means that this author thinks that a Nazir does not bring a Shelamim. Now, who would be the author of this baraita? If you say that the machloket between Rabbi and Chachamim applies to a Ola and Shelamim, also, meaning that Rabbi Meir would say you can bring Ola and Shelamim, and maybe also even Asham and Chatat, maybe or maybe not. But if you say that the Rabbi Meir says you can bring an Ola Shelamim, and the sages say you can bring nothing, zero, a Nazir cannot bring any korbanot because they're all, as part of it being a Nazir, they're all mandatory once he became a Nazir, then that's fine, because you could say that the author of this baraita would be the Rabbanan. Hamane Rabbanan hi. Rabbanan say that a Nazir does not bring anything. That's why the baraita left out Zeroa Beshela. Ela yamat bechatat v'asham pelige hamane. But if you say Rabbi Meir and the sages are arguing only about chatat and asham, and that they're in agreement that a Nazir can bring his olah and shelamim, well, if a Nazir can bring a shelamim, then this baraita should have also said that, oh, if he brings a shelamim, then the zerah b'shela has to go to the kohen on a public bama, but not on the private one. He didn't bring that, and therefore, you see, we're going to be stuck. We're going to have no author of this baraita. Rather, if we're going to quote Shemuel, must be that this is what he said. Amar Shemuel, machloket be'ola u'shtamim, aval bechatat ve'asham dibra kol chavot ninhu ve'la karbi. In fact, the machloket between Rabbi Meir and the sages is regarding ola and shelamim. That's where Rabbi Meir says a Nazir can bring an ola and shelamim, because even though he has to bring it now, but he didn't have to become a Nazir in the first place, so he can continue and bring an Ola and Shelamim. That's the machloket. Then the sages say, no, you can bring a voluntary Ola Shelamim, but you can't bring it as a Nazir, because that's called a mandatory Ola. That's called a mandatory Ola or Shelamim. However, when it comes to a Chatat and Asham, even Rabbi Meir agrees that he cannot bring it zero, because that's not a type of korban that is generally a volunteer korban, and therefore the Nazir cannot bring it at all. So it must be Shemuel said that. And if so, then we have an answer. The author of that baraita can be Rabbanan, who say that the Nazir does not bring anything at all, not even the Shelamim. And that's why that baraita left out the Zeroa B'Shela. Amar Mor, Chachamim Omerim, Kol She'asibur Makribin Be'ohel V'chule. So now going back to the statement of the Chachamim, that anything that the community sacrificed in Ohel Moed when it was in the desert, they also continued to sacrifice. So therefore communal offerings can still be offered on the large public bama. However, individual obligatory offerings cannot be offered on it. My ta'amau de Rabbanan. What's the source for Rabbanan? Amar kera ish hayashar be'einav ya'aseh ish yesharot hu delikrub chabot la likrub ve'sibur afilu chabot likrub. Because the pasuk when Hashem told Moshe that now the laws are going to be different when you're going into the land, it says ish, an individual, hayashar be'einav, and we said that yashar is referring to something that hayashar be'einav, something that he feels like bringing, meaning a voluntary offering. So when it comes to ish, an individual, he's the one that can only bring voluntary offerings, because it says ish and then it says yesharot hu delikrob, but he cannot bring mandatory offerings. However, that only applies to an individual. If it's talking about a community, they can bring anything that they anything that they need to bring, and so the Sibur does offer obligatory offerings. Rabbi Yehuda amar lach ki ketib hayashar be'einav udichtib alva be'bama gedola afilu chabot name likrub. Rabbi Yehuda disagreed with Chachamim and said that an individual can bring mandatory offerings on the public bama. It's just that on the private one, he can only bring voluntary ones, but on the public one, he can bring even compulsory ones. So what is he going to do? How's he going to read that pasuk? He says, take the word yashar and read it together with be'einav, so that it means be'einav, meaning on his own bama, on the private bama, he can only bring yashar, the voluntary offerings. Yashar is that which he wanted to bring, and be'enav, in his own eyes, on his own location and mizbeach. However, that leaves open that on a bama gedolah, which is not only be'enav, that's a public bama, then even an individual can bring his compulsory offerings. Ela haketib ish. Now, what's the Biudah going to do with the word ish? It does start with the word ish. Lav lememra di ish yesharot hu likrub hachobot la likrub. Is the Biudah not going to agree that the word ish means, like Rabbanan applied it, to say that an individual can bring voluntary offerings, but not compulsory offerings? Otherwise, what is he going to do with the word ish? And the Biudah has an answer. Ki ketib ish lachshir et hazar. The word ish comes to include, to validate, a non-Kohen on a private altar. If you have a private altar, even a non-Kohen can serve there. On the public altar, it has to be Kohanim. Private altar, ish. That's what ish means. Zar me vezarak Kohen et hadam al mizbach Hashem nafka. Hold on, we don't need the word ish to teach me that a non-Kohen can serve on a private bama, because we can learn the law of a non-Kohen on a private bama from the pasuk that says that a Kohen shall dash the blood against the altar of Hashem at the entrance of meeting. And that's talking about the public altar. Only a Kohen can do. We can infer from that by ourselves that if it's not a public mizbeach Hashem, the official one, then a non-Kohen can do it. So I already know that from this pasuk. I don't need ish. And then back to the question against the Biudah. What are you going to do with the word ish? And Biudah will answer, if I only had this pasuk that says that you need a Kohen for the Bama Gedolah, I might think that for the private Bama, that you fine, you don't need a Kohen, but maybe you need a Bechor. Just like it was before the Mishkan was built, in the original time of Bamot, at that time the Bechorot were the holy ones. They were the ones that were functioning in the private Bamot. So I might think that now too in Gilgal, that only a Bechor can offer sacrifices and not any other non-Kohen. So that's why we need the word ish to teach me that in a private altar, anyone can offer. It does not have to be a Kohen, does not have to be a Bechor. Chachamim hanu tanakama. We ask, isn't Chachamim who respond to Rabbi Yehuda sounds the same as the sages that come also before Rabbi Yehuda? Remember over here in the structure, said we had first Rabbi Meir and then Chachamim, a short thing, and then Rabbi Yehuda and then Chachamim again. And if you look at the two statements of Chachamim, they sound the same, just one is shorter and one's longer. So what's the difference? Amar Papa, Karabu, Nesachim, Bamidbad, Ika Benaihu. In fact, there is a difference, because the second paragraph, which says a much longer statement, that's coming to include something else, which is wine libations. That according to the first Chachamim there, wine libations were not offered in the midbar, nor in Gilgal, but only afterwards. Whereas according to the Chachamim at the end, after Rabbi Yehuda, since they say a more inclusive statement, that means according to them, that statement makes a comparison between what was done before and what was done after. Gilgal. Since it's making this equivalence, so that sounds like just like after and before the wine libations were made. So since it gives an equivalence, it sounds like yes, in fact, wine libations were made in both cases. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.